Hello, world. Welcome to Notes from the Aleph, a high point where all things are visible, a podcast where a bunch of people are angry at make-believe. I'm Norman Rafferty. I just got back from First Squared Con. Thanks, everybody who came by to say hi, where I'm repping Sanguine Games, where we make tabletop role-playing games. I've been doing so for over 20 years. Today I'm joined, I guess on my left, which would be this hand. I'm joined today by Lessons Learned.
Who I am running a game here on every Sunday on Rakta's channel. We're running Shadowrun Mirrored Souls, and also I am a budding game designer and a writer over Amazon on Night and Stars, as well as a streamer on Twitch and on Twitter, on YouTube.
Yep, and I also have with me today RedRabbit.
Hey, I am RedRabbit. I am running our Ironclaw game on Wednesday mornings, which is fantastic, and I'm playing in our Sunday game of Forbidden Lands, which is also fantastic. And on my free time, I'm also playing Vampire 5th Edition, which I'm running, and I'm running a game called Monster Care Squad, which is a weird Powered by the Apocalypse thing. And what else? I love kickstarting projects that I forget about and then receive in the mail 3 years later.
Oh, speaking of someone who does that, thank you. So today we're discussing the design theory because I've had my mind changed by some of the stuff that goes on here because I'm an angry curmudgeon. I like to hear about what's going on in gaming. And one topic that's been going around is what we're going to call I've heard called the shadow ride or the amusement park ride, but today we're using the phrases Funhouse dungeons and guided tours, asking just how much of a show is this? There is a long tradition in tabletop gaming of sort of going through a sort of linear dungeon from room to room. I think this started, there's a Alice in Wonderland adaptation that goes way back to D&D, and I'm not sure if that's before or after the Alice in Wonderland adaptation that showed up in Paranoia, which is a science fiction role-playing game. Where those
Which one? Beyond the Magic Mirror? I think it was X3, I don't remember which one it was.
There's also specifically, I think it's called like not Murder World, but it was in Dragon Magazine and written by Gary Gygax himself. It's one of the first examples of that. But later on, there would also be, since this is in the news now, we can't forget that Dragonlance was a very successful series of fiction books published by the makers of Dungeons and Dragons. They just announced, I think last week, Hasbro is bringing it back as a new series you can participate in. And that was also presented as a bunch of dungeons that basically transcribed what was in the novels into dungeon format, which of course meant that if you were just going to copy the plot of a novel into a dungeon, you can divide it into small little boxes to go through, but if it's going to follow the same storyline, you'd basically be copying what was already in the novels in a game format. And I don't think anyone here but me has had any experience with that, right? No. And then later on, okay, and then just to decide this later on, the Diana Jones Award became sort of famous. There was an attempt to make the Indiana Jones movies into a tabletop franchise, and very famously it fell on its face because all the designers did was just take the characters from the movie and take all the storylines and just assign, okay, what if you had to make rolls to not fall off the horse or fall off the truck or fall to your death during the scene? Would that actually be a game? And famously, reviewers rejected this, saying, this is the most boring crap ever. So let's go ahead and I think who brought this up? Red, did you bring this one up?
No, this is not mine. I've got thoughts, but this is not one of mine.
Well, I want to give some history on it, but I also want to hear what some of the more modern stuff are before I go into how I hate the Metro series.
Okay. Well, yeah. What do you have, Lessons?
Well, I think we sort of touch a little bit on this when we're talking about scripted versus, script versus tool set. And I think this is sort of the epitome of that. The pre-built adventure that has those ideas put forward. Like the Funhouse dungeon, it's go in there and there's a wacky bunch of stuff, and there's a room, not worst canary, more memorable ones where 30 orcs in a 10 by 10 room. It's like, how do they even breathe, right? or a reverse pyramid with layers of different marine animals that can attack you at each layer, right? It was designed from the point of view of just have fun, right? We're going to put all these monsters together. It's all about the fighting and the wackiness and the chances and whether you can survive or not. And if you get a cool magical weapon or weapons along the way, eternal champions were harmed in the making of this module, then so be it. But a lot of people are like, oh, this is so weird because it doesn't make any sense. And why are we doing this? And who would build a dungeon like this? And this is a madhouse, dead corpse, thing. So why don't you give me some signal posts of what I should be doing? Okay, we're going to give you Dragonlance, where we literally tell you if your players don't do this, this is what's going to happen, so that they can survive. Because, even though the story says rock falls, everyone dies, we can't have you die in the first chapter because because we have to play the other 7.
And we're comparing this to an amusement park ride. Like always the famous one. There's always be the jungle tour where, oh no, we're getting attacked by a hippo, says your tour guide. Let me pull out this gun to scare it off. Blam! The crisis averted. And this can be a lot of entertaining because you're there in the experience of being on the ride. Like, wow, I've never done this before. But it is, as you just described, it's kind of flying in the face. Like, I'm always talking about how role-playing games used to be. They're not right now, but they used to be sold on the idea of it's a theater of imagination. Whatever you can think of, make the character you want to see in the world. And, it's the only limits are what you can think of and what you can do, which, of course, is at exact odds with what you've just described of don't think about why this exists or anything here. Just experience it. Don't, try to reason with it or engage with it. It's just a thing in front of you.
So maybe my definition is a little bit different. I've never really played one of these. I know there's famous examples of it, but I always thought of the Funhouse thing as being a Funhouse dungeon, as being those dungeons where the traps are so ridiculous and over complicated and basically like purposefully dense, right? To the point where it's like, okay, there's a pit and there's spikes in the bottom of the pit and there's a rope dangling in the middle and you can jump to the rope, and then you jump to the rope and then it turns out the rope wasn't attached to anything and it falls and you fall in the pit.
That's why I think Griffin may have suggested Funhouse. I'm much more talking about the guided tour experience, the one where you're supposed to go from because you can see this, for example, in Vampire. There are many published vampire adventures that are, you meet this one guy and we describe how cool he is. I need you to go on an errand for me. You then go from his place to point B where you meet another vampire who is also cool and describes in detail how cool they are. And you negotiate with them to find out the one thing they want, and then you go to point C to do the one thing they want. This is a guided tour in the fact that you don't actually have any free agency. You're here to experience all the things that they're throwing at you in the big narrative. You respond to it, but you are not an actual agent who exerts any choice in where we're going or what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's very much similar to a topic that we already tackled in another podcast. So I guess the question that I would have is like, why do these things why did this format become popular in the first place? Because there's plenty of them out there. I mean, we have guided tours in recent adventure collections from Wizards of the Coast for 5th edition D&D. Like, they're not something that was like, oh, we didn't know what we were doing back in the 80s, and then we got wise. It's like, no, people still make this stuff today, and people still play it and consider it to be,
Well,
standard.
It's I mean, it gets into the idea of experience. Like I've been talking, for example, a big deal about performative, because I used to call this Rosencrantz role playing, where we just go from point A to point B, and our goal is, I guess, to not die, or if it's D&D, don't die too much. When we're going from there, and we don't have a lot of agency of what's going on, so we entertain ourselves and nowadays our audience by cracking wise about what's going on before us, and making jokes and being clever about that, or doing minor things that don't affect the tour. But yeah, I mean, I can see why it's popular, because you'll often get first of all, the computer games are like this. I mean, someone just brought up Mass Effect. Everyone was talking about how Mass Effect was a disappointment because I thought we had branching storylines. Instead, at the end, we get all the way to the end, and there's push the red button or push the green button to decide your one ending. I thought we had choice and freedom and all this kind of stuff. That's what you sold us on. So, it was, but it was the computer game people was easier to write. And I have to emphasize that we are doing tabletop gaming as a hobby. So one reason why this format is popular is because radiant storytelling, the idea that can go any way up to and including failure, is a lot more difficult. If I say we're going to A and then B and then C, and then we go from A and then B and then C with no deviations whatsoever, that's easier on the game master to run that.
Oh, yeah. I think a lot of people begin the game thinking, or begin writing adventures thinking like, okay, well, we'll start from the end. We're going to fight this red dragon. I know that's my go-to, but I think it's a good example. We're going to fight this red dragon. It's going to be epic. It's going to be on the side of a cliff and a crumbling castle, and there's going to be like, the sky will be falling and meteors are raining down. And like, they're like, okay, so how do I get there? And then everything that leads up to it has to necessarily lead into the next thing because that's how you write a story. Maybe it also comes from just narrative structure. People tend to maybe approach these games like they are stories because obviously they're drawing influence from stories. People are attracted to these games for the genre conventions which they fell in love with from stories. So maybe that's it. I don't know.
Yeah, but like I said before, you run the risk of taking the game out of, in this case, the tabletop RPG, right? Like the G out of the tabletop RPG, right? So it's like, if you don't have any choice, then just tell me when to roll and I'll just sit there and roll when you want me to. And then when said the night's over, it's like, well, thank you for inviting me, but I think I won't be coming back.
Well, I mean, it hasn't been an obsession of Aleph if Rafferty's not complaining about streamers. I mean, in some ways, like if you were watching something like Critical Role, you would see that sort of presentation style, what the director presents with a situation. And while admittedly they do improv different stuff, it's largely presented as in the performers are expecting this. They're expecting, I will be presented with something today. I need to react to it in character in a way that is entertaining for the audience. And, it might be fun for them. But like this is the expectation they have. They don't expect the game to be radiant, which got into what Lessons was talking about with I guess you're quoting White Plume Mountain or Lost Towers of Inverness, where you have these dungeons that make absolutely no sense whatsoever. But you're not supposed to ask questions about why they exist or why they are this way. You're supposed to engage them with them as they are. And that's sort of like a paradox that goes against, that's part of why I rail against Dungeons & Dragons, because Dungeons & Dragons seems to exist in this fantasy realm of nonsense. It's not like, say, God, I can't believe this, Shadowrun or Vampire, which at least have pretenses of being like the real world.
But I think in many ways, these two dungeons, the two dungeon setups are kind of the same. We just kind of described that they're not that different because we're not supposed to question what happens. Whether it's because there is an existing, narrative structure, or because the GM decided, I just want to have the 30 orcs in the room, right? You just got to go and do it. You got to open the door and fight the orcs, or you got to act surprised when the orcs show up because this is the part where the orcs show up.
Well,
right?
and you'll often see essays in Dungeons & Dragons itself that talk about the dungeon as an adventure metaphor, because there's usually one entrance to the dungeon. So you go in there and you might have branching paths because there are different rooms you can go to. And a lot of adventures will eventually have all the rooms lead to the boss encounter, the one that's the really big one that has all the treasure. Not all dungeons are like that, but some of the big ones are. And so in that way, they're kind of linear and kind of guided. But this, of course, this starts to fall apart when you ask, why are we doing a dungeon? Is this what adventuring is, going into a bunch of boxed encounters and getting all the way to the end? I'm not saying you can't do that, but if you are doing that, then we're not doing the rich tapestry of I'm realizing my character, my hopes and dreams, and my own ambitions, and I'm also a participant in the story. I know Red brought up the idea that the GM is a player, and I would take the opposite of, like, are the players game masters? Do the players have any say of what's going on in the story? Because an amusement park ride says the players don't.
Mm-hmm.
Right, yeah. I also think that was an interesting thing that you raised before, because I feel like there's players out there who don't want that responsibility. Not only that it would never cross their minds to be a game master because they see it as work and not fun, but even being asked to provide creative input for the world of the game that they're playing is more than they want to contribute, right? They really do want to be they want to react to a world that's been presented for them. They don't want to have any kind of ownership over that world. I mean, maybe beyond the, like, oh yes, I'm orphaned, my parents were killed by orcs.
But is that a thing that we have trained players to do, rather than a thing that is something that they come with a table with? Because I notice in my own experience that a lot of players many players, not all, everybody, I have this rich background for my character, and they came from this, royal family that fell out of grace and all that. It's like, GM goes like, yeah, whatever, that's great. By the way, your parents are already dead, and here's the entrance to the dungeon, so get in there.
Oh no, I would completely agree with Lessons. When I get new people who have never played a tabletop game before, they are often full of grandiose ideas of exactly what they want to be something exciting. They'll often do an extended family, like they're just building one character, but they're like husbands or wives or spouses or families or extended relationships. They'll often invent an entire hierarchy, like this is the thriving business that my family runs, or this is our long lineage. And I love reading all of this. And by the way, if we're playing Dungeons & Dragons, throw all that out the window, because the game actively denies you access to these kinds of tools. This is not what you'll be doing today. You're going to be a murder tourist and you're going to like it. And then all the adventures are written like that. I've been questioning these adventures that seem to be written to shut you up, written to, or to give you the expectations of, yeah, of course there are torches on the walls. Of course the things are here to be murdered. Of course they're here. Of course everything's been labeled evil for you and convenience. And we also lower their intelligences so they fight stupidly too. So you can feel good about murdering them and not ask questions. And it's framed in such a way that it seems to match the expectations. I think that's why you're seeing a backlash against that, because there are some people who are showing up as designers or streamers who are asking, well, wait a minute, this feels extremely reductive the way you've written it. And we're getting people who are pushing back saying, no, it's supposed to be like that.
So I think on the subject of like linearity and closed design, we're kind of all in agreement here, but maybe I want to twist this slightly, because I will say that there is a degree of there is a type of adventure writing that I do like that maybe leads to this a little bit, and even if that's not where the common D&D player or play style is trending, I still think it has value. And I'll say that, like, we've had this discussion before too, where I think the mechanics of D&D support a very specific kind of game, and it's not at all the kind of game that you see people playing on streams and things. So maybe this is where that tension comes from. But what I'm talking about is the 5-room dungeon approach, which is something that I don't know where it started, but it's picked up a lot of steam in certain D&D game mastering communities as like a tool set or an approach to create a dynamic single session dungeon based adventure. And basically it's just reframing the like 5-act structure of movies and things for a game setting. It's how to create a series of encounters, and each one kind of fits a different theme that should provide like variety and rising and falling action. And I think it works well because, again, I think D&D is at its best when it is providing you like a setting or a backdrop and some monsters and saying go wild, like explore stuff.
See, it's the last part of it's not go wild, it's go on the amusement park ride, go beat the boss and kill all the monsters along the way. You don't actually have, it's not go wild. You're not allowed to leave the ride.
Yeah, keep
Okay,
your
but
hands in the right at all times. Make sure that you don't throw anything outside, etc., etc.
all right. So now we have conflict. Now this is good because again,
oh, good.
no, I was gonna say like this is good because I don't think that is something I have a problem with in D&D. I think that if you come to the D&D table and you don't expect to kill monsters and drink potions, then you're coming with a flawed expectation.
Now, see, okay, like this is all up in arms. First of all, speaking as the angry Andy, I'm not coming to the D&D table. And secondly, there will be people who will, I guess, lie to you. Because if you ask people what's so great about D&D, a lot of them will say, oh yeah, you get to play your own character, and it's about the choices you want to make. It's not like a stupid computer game where you can only do what the Quest computer game want. You can do anything you want. And for what you just said of, no, you come to D&D to kill monsters and take their treasure, you're just saying that's a lie.
Yeah. No, I'm calling WotC liars. I have for a long time.
Yeah, because I was also going to express that like one huge problem was I think when Eberron came out, and also it's the stuff like Dragon Heist, where they wanted to start doing like, well, what if we did urban and intercity intrigue? And one of the problems was, like you just said, it's like, well, D&D works its best for that, and you wind up with these Funhouse tours, these scripted things of where we would go to where there was a murder and we can't solve the murder. We're not supposed to. Instead, we would use this to go rendezvous with someone else who would tell us something, and then bad guys would attack us because it's time for two guys to burst in the door and attack. And this entire time that we're doing all this tour and they're handing us all this lore, it feels very oppressive because it's, first of all, it leans on the game master to be a better like character actor, which I think puts a lot of responsibility on them. But secondly, it also means we kind of check out with the engagement, because if we try to push against the story and try to go in different directions or look up different clues, eventually we realize none of that will actually work. We're going from point B to point C, no matter what's going on. It turns the game master into a bad person, because the GM is like, hey, I'm just following the adventure. I'm just here to play a game. I'm not, the game doesn't give me any tools to improv. And also it's Dungeons and Dragons. We're not here to improv. And that gets, that's why, I guess I'll wrap this up again by saying, like, that's why performative stuff has really lent into that. Like, the streamers are really, really, really good at not having any free will and doing the amusement park ride. They're very entertaining while on the ride, but their agency is extremely limited. They're doing what they're told or what they're paid to do.
No, I think, well, and you actually talked about this in a way, it's a shift in the agency, right? They get a free reign, more or less, to act up, and their characterization of their characters, how they speak, how they, if they act surprised, and they're crafting the character in the moment, improv. But those characters still have to do the overall actions as demanded by the setup, right? In the way that it's prescribed.
Yes,
it's a shift on agency, which
right. And in theory, you could fail. Like, I did want to bring up our good old go-to Forbidden Lands on this, because Forbidden Lands is like, sure, Forbidden Lands is an incredibly linear game, but it has a fail state. You can fucking die. And Dungeons and Dragons used to have that as a serious component of the roguelike, where it's okay that it's linear because the actual challenge is a survival challenge. Can we get through this series of encounters while minimizing loss? And that, now you have to go into Forbidden Lands expecting that, but you see a different thing nowadays. They don't tell you in modern D&D you're going to die. I'm always pointing out, you read the 80s D&D, people are dying in the tutorial. Okay, you don't see that
I would
anymore.
like some of that. I'd like more examples of play where people die and they're just like, oh, well, I failed my second death save. Oh, I just got hit by a goblin. Yeah, you're dead. What, I'm dead?
And here's Rafferty's thing. Second death save? What kind of sissy game is this? But
I know, right? Well, no, that's the thing. It's there, and they never even, they never address it, because the reason there's 3 death saves is it gives you plenty of opportunities to talk your way out of dying at the table.
Well, it's because the modern game is, you get into the modern performative game. Like a game like Vampire, it doesn't matter if the storylines are incredibly linear, because in most of the published adventures, it's incredibly linear. because you're there to be validated in your role. You're there to show off the cool vampire you are and drop some, deep dank Malkavian or Anarch lore while the game is going on. And have other people validate you because every vampire in the game is young, cool, respected. You often have an entourage. You have wealth, status, and superpowers. So, in those games, those games are highly performative, and that's the big selling point behind them. You run into a problem when you get a game like Dungeons and Dragons that was designed to be a survival challenge, but now they're telling you, oh no, spend hours making your character, describe all of your hopes and dreams, decide your stats, and here's your entire upgrade path spelled out you for the next 20 levels. You get to choose every step of the way. None of this is random. So that sort of design is at odds with the idea of, by the way, you can also affect the world. But I'm also wondering if maybe we should stop being negative and start talking about the positive things that we've seen to help radiant storytelling, because I can think of a few, but I want to yield the floor.
I think one of the reasons, and you went back to the fact that it's easier in GMs, is that they think everything is, especially if you're a beginner at GM, everything is spelled out clearly, right? If this goes evil here, this is what happens. So you don't have to worry about other things because this is what's supposed to happen when they kick in the door or they talk to NPC or something like that. So especially as a introductory tool, I think they're great. I think they kind of break down after you play for a while. People are like, oh, so of course this is going to happen. It's like, Jack in the Box. The first time you're scared. The second time is like, of course, it's just a box, put the thing inside. I mean, I already saw it. So, it's, but I think one other thing is, and also when you're appealing to a wide audience, it's very difficult to predict all the things that could happen. Right. So from a writer perspective, there is a temptation to make sure that you narrow it down, to make sure that you transmit your ideas as clearly as possible so that, hey, it's a good adventure because you did the thing that I expect you to do.
Well,
sorry, because I want to defend this a little bit too, because I think it has value outside of just being, I want to distinguish something too. So I want to distinguish our definition here of the Funhouse dungeon or the haunted hayride or whatever we're calling it from just a dungeon delve adventure, right? Mm-hmm. Because there's a degree of linearity implied there, I think, and a degree of a lack of agency for the players. Now, I think that the game, like a dungeon delve adventure, can be really good and still have agency, right? We compared that to the Dragon Heist, right, where you're taking this sort of linear collection of events and you're taking it out of a dungeon and putting it in a city. The problem that you get there, and what Rafferty was saying, is that there's still walls, but the walls are narrative and they're invisible, right? I don't think there's any shame of dropping people in a dungeon map and saying look, there's some rooms in here. You're going to tackle them. How are you going to tackle them? You still have freedom of approach. You still have, you're still going to be fighting monsters. You're not going to be able to go left and burrow into the dirt 100 feet.
Oh, your mic cut out.
Yeah, mic cut out.
Yeah, your mic's dead. But what we're waiting for that is and here's where Rafferty to complain. I mean, you'll have spells like dig and excavate and portable holes that would let you do that, but we'll just tell you they don't work.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Your mic's back. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. So, okay. Here's the thing, right? In the creative space, in the mental universe that you create as a GM, when you're creating a dungeon crawl adventure for D&D, you don't have to worry about what's 100 feet in the dirt to the left of the westernmost wall of the dungeon, right? And your characters, maybe they could be empowered to do that they could move Earth and teleport and Dimension Door and go into that space, but there's no reason for them to expect that anything will be there, right? And I think there's value in that. I think that's what makes this game so accessible for people who are starting RPGs. It's the reason why it's the jumping off point for a lot of GMs also, because that design space is, it's so, it's not ambiguous at all. And obviously RPGs can get very ambiguous, and that can be a great thing. And they can spiral out from the unforeseen decisions of the players and stuff. But I think D&D mechanically doesn't need that to work as a game. I think it is kind of like a board game in its mechanics, right? So I want to distinguish that from the guided tour. And I think when we talk about guided tour, it's like, okay, you're going to go meet this NPC. He's going to tell you to go here. That NPC is going to tell you to go there. You're going to collect this item. And until, and there's really, the walls are still there. The stone walls are still there. They're just invisible, because if you try to do anything that isn't going to the next step in the process, the DM will try to steer you back on track, or the game will come to a complete and utter halt. And that is bad design. Okay, but that's why I think the dungeon as a setting is so good, and people take it for granted. People think it's really boring and it's really constrictive, but there's reasons why it is that way.
Okay, I want to jump in because I think let's go conceptually to see what exactly a dungeon is. The dungeon is a flow chart. That's what a dungeon really is. You can literally make a dungeon without no illustration, just a flow chart, and say, if your player do this, this happens. If they don't, do that. I think the difference is in the Funhouse dungeon has at least the yes and no answer. If your players do this, this happens. If they don't, something else happens.
That is not what I was thinking. Oh, Funhouse.
Well, I've seen the metaphor.
And I'm trying to finish my thought process. And the guided tour has no option. It only has the yes options.
Well, speaking of that, okay, because I've heard the dungeon compared to a flowchart, and it's a little confusing. Back when the dungeon was sort of a survival challenge, it would often be a series of rooms, not all of which you had to engage with. The original presentation of the dungeon was you go to this place and your goal is to get out with more money and experience than you lose going in. That's the original goal.
Yes.
Unless it's a tournament adventure like Tomb of Horrors, in which case your goal is to score as many points as possible so you're the winner. Now,
that's my understanding of a Funhouse dungeon, by the way.
Well, that's why guided tour was the phrase that I wanted, because a Funhouse one would be linear, where we would lead you from room to room and we would tell you. But also want to emphasize this, it also used to be, like, speaking of how they've gotten a little sissy, I got any better word than that. There's this idea, because I also say the word failing forward. There was a Rafferty, you're using it wrong. But the idea that, like, by a survival challenge, there used to be a fail state, as in you could just die permanently. So, like that's why they talk about Tomb of Horrors. It's like you could fall into a sphere of annihilation. Dude, that is like extra dead. Or be trapped in a pocket dimension and there's no way to retrieve you. Extra dead. Mm-hmm. Because of, for a thing you could skip, like Tomb of Horrors there's a hole in the wall. You could just walk right past it and not screw with it, or you could stick your arm in it. I stick my arm in it. Your arm's chopped off. Ha ha ha. There would be, like, you was a time clock. You were running out of food. Once again, this is why I'm bringing up Forbidden Lands, because Forbidden Lands is bringing that back, where you might run into side quests. You might avoid a combat encounter
on purpose.
Right, on purpose. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which I mentioned that because, like, I have trouble with, like, any gamer after 2000 does not understand the concept of avoiding in a combat encounter. Like, even that simple choice. They will throw themselves at it, and if it kills them, prevailing advice is a good GM will find some way to get around the TPK. Instead of what you used to see, which was your idea was to avoid the TPK. This is, once again, the difference of a guided tour. You don't go on a guided tour expecting to get killed. Everyone dies in the second room. Whereas an old school dungeon would have no compunction about doing that. And the better ones have the measured risk. You can survive Tomb of Horrors by not engaging with any of the stupid shit, because some of it's incredibly obvious. So, the guided tour is the one where you don't even have the freedom to die.
This really is the unicorn book from Candlekeep Mysteries. This was the famous adventure that I complained about before. Because when you talk about, yes, you don't even have the freedom to die. If a character dies in an encounter, they're like, oh, you just show up outside of the book, and then you get a magical short rest that restores all of your health points. It's like an 8-hour rest, but but time works funny. So then you just jump back in the book, and you're right back where you left off, but you're like full up to full resources.
I know.
Like,
well, and related to this is the Dark Souls role-playing game just came out, and of course they use D&D, and it's hilarious because they keep trying to explain how hardcore the game is. Like, if you all die, you'll all be resurrected at the last checkpoint. And like this is supposed to be hardcore in some way. Like, this is more hardcore than regular D&D.
Yeah.
So it's that's kind of what we're but to get more forward thinking about this, like, we have seen one that's a metaphor that I think hasn't been interpreted correctly, which is I'll call the fronts, because fronting showed up in Power by the Apocalypse and was misinterpreted by Dungeon World, where the idea that instead of phrasing things as a static room that waits for players to enter and the only way to resolve it is combat, in theory you might do fronts as a series of things or entities or organizations that are going on. You know, like there might be the bandits on the side, the outlaws of the water margin over here, the mutants of the cold pits over here. And you might decide to engage them or not. And that way you would at least have some radiant storytelling, because even though engaging them could be pretty dungeon-like, you would just go there, go into a complex and fight your way from room to room, at least you would have some agency about what you engaged. And treating them as like that's a very simple example of radiant storytelling that was boiled down to be extremely simple so people could digest it.
Yeah. I think I don't even know if I'm arguing this point anymore, but
I'm also like, I want to get into things that are positive. Like for example, I'll also talk about some Palladium adventures. I've already talked about a D&D adventure where it's in the middle of a desert and we encountered a dryad. Now, the way the adventure's scripted, if we did it in the guided tour format, there's no provisions at all for parley. You just engage this dryad and in combat, because that's the only thing the adventure designers could think of. In fact, some parts of the adventure later don't make any sense if you don't actually kill the dryad. Like, I keep complaining about the note on their body. You would think that like even the slightest bit, like you'd even see this in 1980s adventures, that they might make a sidebar note that says, if the players choose to skip this or talk their way out of this encounter, since the dryad is a sentient being with language, you know, that the players might get some reward or at least get past them, or the dryad might demand tribute, you know, might even demand something absurd. Just that one tiny sentence of the dryad is a willful being that can be interacted with in a way different than killing them would change this from a guided tour. And part of the huge Jeremiah I'm on today about it is like, you won't even see that in these published adventures. The notion, you know, once again, tied up with the alignment discussion. So D&D, you can be good, neutral, or evil, but that won't matter either. Everything you meet, you're going to kill.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess going back to what I was trying to get at with the dungeon as a design space, I don't think that. So what you're saying, right, is that people are creating these adventures, and in these adventures there are these circumstances that they write narratively to be one very specific type of encounter, right? Okay, you're going to fight this dryad, right? And I think people would look.
Or one very specific conclusion. There's only one way to resolve this.
Exactly, right? And when I look at this stuff, I think, and maybe this is making certain suppositions about how people approach the game. You know what, obviously is. But when I look at that, it's like, you could write, okay, room A, 4 goblins. Room B, a magical fountain trap. Room C, you know, a dragon and some gold, right? And that could be the entire text of your adventure. And within that space, you could still have the players interacting with the goblins. You know, they could try to trade with them. They could try to ambush them. They could try to sneak past them. Like, all of these are I think, implicit options. Effectively, what you're doing with a lot of these sort of dungeon settings is you're just creating scenery and backdrop for the play to unfold onto, right?
Well, but this is where I'm going to stand up and saying, there isn't any text that says you can't do that. You are 100% correct. But then the next thing I want to say is, but there isn't any text that says you can do that. Like, there's nothing in anything that suggests you'll do something differently. And the way the adventures are written, like we were just complaining about Candlekeep, where they literally edited out all the neutral UNT. So they removed that as a complication. Like, obviously the designers thought that was too much. And all the published adventures, I keep joking about the note everyone has on their body. So after you kill them, you can read the note and figure out where to go to next. There's
that's
nothing
narrative wall
stated in there of any provision whatsoever. And when the game master gets this, they read this and they see, okay, you're supposed to kill everybody and move to the next thing. And literally this, like, people will tell me like a bad GM will do this. No, this is a regular GM. I've gotten pushback in these games where I say, well, what if we do something different? And the game master, like, gets upset. You're not supposed to do something different. You're supposed to do what it says here. I don't know how to come up with anything different, and we're playing the game the way it's written. This is what we're supposed to do. That's what I'm rebelling against here, is the idea that this gets baked into the game as that's what it is. And they don't even entertain the idea that you might do something else.
So I like the idea that we're calling for maybe more explanation as to like the core cycle of what, or maybe the expectations of what players can and can't do within the space, right? I would say that I think for a long time it was implicit. And if we're going to go and use Funhouse traps as an example, a lot of those things were created as a reaction to players being creative within a very simple space.
Yeah, they started punishing you with the reverse gravity spike traps.
Yes, reverse gravity spike trap, or, the traps that detonate, 10 feet away from the chest because everyone had the 10-foot pole, right? But that was proof that people were like within this space of just walking into a room and interacting with some goblins or a trap. People were getting creative. They were using metal spikes to like lock off doors. They were using 10-foot poles.
Well, you were supposed to, but and like what I'm complaining about is one reason why you have this big reductive blow up where people are accusing the game of being racist is because around 4th edition they started labeling everything evil, so it was okay to kill it. And then when people started saying, "Hey," I mean, because the objection, man, here's getting all the hate now. The objection that orcs are inherently evil is the sideline to that is the idea that orcs are inherently killable and not worthy of being players with agency. Like, because that's what they're complaining about, that evil means able to be killed. And so you saw this transformation in the game where, like I complained about the Tyrant Queen, where the Tyrant Queen shows up and they're evil. And so they're just going to rampage through everything. You're supposed to kill them. You're supposed to say, well, it's like, that's how reductive it's gotten, because like we started all of this by people asking, like, isn't that what a game is? Isn't that, do we go to the dungeon and kill everything? And I'm glad we're starting to see games that are expressing the idea of fronts, or like Blades in the Dark and Wicked Ones express the idea of a multipolar chart of things that both like you and dislike you, and the idea of locations that you can go to and address with, and the idea that if you do something that annoys people over here, it would spread to over here, so you might want to curry favor with these people to get benefits with this. The idea of a world that responds to you, and that the choices you make here are going to resonate somewhere else, instead of the Funhouse or guided tour where you go to this dungeon, do a bunch of this dungeon, and nothing matters. Like you just do what you're supposed to do and then go to the next one. And you're not actually, like you said about a GM being a player in a world, you're not actually influencing anything or being a part of one. You're showing up to passively experience what a GM presents to you. And that's not fair to the GM either, because that means that the players become passive because they accept they have no agency, and the GM has to do all the work, making everything and feeling burned out if they have to deviate from that. And that's bad.
Yeah, and I'm not arguing that, because I think on that case we are very much on the same page. Nobody wants a game where the players do not have agency over their own characters. But I guess just to keep the conversation interesting, I am trying to argue for the fact that the simplicity of a game with a very small design space still is valid, like, and still can present people with interesting opportunities and agency, creative expression, right?
Right.
I think I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? I think there's a reason why dungeons exist. And they can be run bad or well.
I would agree with you there, but then the level chart goes up to 20. Like they expect you to play this character for 50 to 100 hours. Yeah. All the while, like I'm saying, yes, every now and then you could do a simple dungeon, but are we supposed to do 100 hours of this? Is like, you won't see any text in there that, that says, shut your expectations down. It's going to be linear from now on. The game tells you you can do other things with it and then fights you on it. So that's kind of why I wanted to end with a positive thing. Like, what are some examples that you would cite, that you've seen in other published stuff that are good examples that that give players agency and make more interesting stories based on what the players like? What have we seen that's positive design? We're talking too much about how D&D has to be like this because it's simple. What's something that challenges that?
I've heard described that the earlier Star Wars D6 games were very much like, very guided tours. But when I played them, and perhaps this was the GM realizing that they just couldn't string us along from one scenario to the other, they proved to be a lot of fun, mostly because I loved inhabiting the body of this character in the Star Wars universe, which I knew had some very clearly defined limits to it. That's part of the buy-in. And second, we were allowed to deviate from the script when that was something that everybody sort of, in this common conversation, agreed that it was more fun to do than whatever was the script was saying.
Yeah, and unfortunately, speaking of someone who's played Star Wars D6 and read the adventures, see, you had a really good GM. You had one who was willing to go off book, because those adventures tend to be very much people who wanted to write Star Wars fanfic. It's one of the reasons why I opened this with complaining about Indiana Jones. It's one thing you really have to worry about when it comes to franchises, because often the franchise is designed to be the franchise and not be your adventure.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm glad you had fun with it. I think what helps that is Star Wars, especially in the D6 era, before not Force Awakens, the Force Unleashed. Before the Force Unleashed, and they're pulling spaceships out of the sky. Jedi were much more grounded, and the game was a lot deadlier. And so that often had people thinking in terms of characters first, which once again is something I would agree with you. The problem with the guided tour is it emphasizes a storyline first that you guys just participate in. Whereas a character-based model of, in your Star Wars adventure, you're meeting these bounty hunters, criminals, and rogue force adepts with their own agendas. And because it's framed like a story of your characters with an agenda and their characters with agenda, it's framed in such a way that you're interacting with people who have their own ambitions and not a monster that sits in a box and waits to die.
I never played Powered by the Apocalypse. Powered by the Apocalypse is not a game. I never played Apocalypse World.
Well,
I did play some
games, yeah.
Dungeon World, yeah.
Well, Dungeon World, okay.
I know you were dunking on Dungeon World's interpretation of fronts, but I do think that I like what they did with fronts. I think it's interesting because it's one of the few games that I've come across that actually proposes a system for you to organize your game notes by. Like when I read fronts, that's how it read to me. It was like, when you're thinking about your games, this is how you think about them. You've got factions or fronts, and they have things that they're going to accomplish unless people interfere with them, and those things have certain challenges associated with them. And like your game notes are basically just tracking where these things are, right? Which is
they took that from Apocalypse World, yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. And first of all, I guess I'll say that's cool. It's a cool approach, especially because I think the reason that a lot of guided tours happen outside of, and I guess within dungeon context as well, but outside of dungeon context is because people are using dungeon design in non-dungeon settings, and they have to hem them in. They're not designing to react to what the players might want to do within a living, breathing world. They're just they've just got these like 4 scenes within this huge world, and they're just trying to keep the characters headed towards one of those 4 scenes at any given time. So instead, having a way to abstractly model that expansive world, I think is a cool approach.
That's why I'm objecting to the simple dungeon model, because I agree with you that it's nice and simple, but you're supposed to stop. You're not like, after you get used to the game and get some stuff, you're supposed to get away from this model, not play it 60 more times.
No, that's fair. To that point, I was going to point out that people do that. As someone who survived like 10 floors of the Dungeon of the Mad Mage, which is my only run-in with a mega dungeon, which I would not recommend. That I'm not a dungeon delver player. I do get incredibly bored of that style of game, so I get you. Maybe it's not a great example.
So you'll recommend it, but you were really bored.
No, I said I would not recommend it. I would not recommend anyone doing it because personally I get very bored. But I will say there are people for whom that is all they want. That is enough for them, is a bunch of rooms, funny shaped rooms with goblins in them.
And I want to put a side note here, because Theta said, well, are we shaming GMs for not getting better? No, we're shaming designers.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Pretty
like
much.
Dungeon World and Powered by the Apocalypse have been out for like 8, maybe 10 years now. And the idea of treating, like, I like the idea of treating fronts, because it was the idea of, what if we had 3 linear dungeons, but each time you went to one of them, you were losing time in the other 2.
Right.
And so now there's a time pressure. So not only you're choosing which one. So even though these could be very simplistic guided tours in and of themselves, we're picking each one. Like, I'm usually giving guff to Kingmaker for Pathfinder. But on the other hand, that's an idea where there's a huge map and it's filled with all of this stuff and there's all these things going on. And you have to choose which ones you're engaging with at certain times. I'm a little sorry Griffin's not here, because Griffin could talk about the emergence that came out of that. If the players went and did this thing over here, and now something's running loose and cursing everybody all over everything else because they did that. It's still sort of simple, but these simple fronts, these little things, have their own little agendas that are now making for a complex world. That's an example of Kingmaker presenting the idea of complexity out of simple choices. And so, I'm mad at the game design, because I'm angry at I was on some adventures, and whenever we tried to do something that wasn't written into it, the GM would say, we have to go back to the plot line. I don't know what to do if you do anything differently. Mm-hmm. And I have to blame the adventure for not having, like, we can say, well, it's implicit GM. There's not a single sentence in the text that tells the GM what to do if we do anything differently than what we're supposed to. And that's what I'm complaining about. That's what's rubbed off. And I guess my last note would be, part of the reason people think that is because of fucking Ubisoft and Rockstar. Because in a Grand Theft Auto game, there's a linear storyline, but you can fuck off and ignore it all you want. It just sits there and waits for you to go to the next quest, especially if you die multiple times. Whereas and people have had experience with computer games. Whereas in a tabletop game, time is supposed to be linear and keep moving forward. It's supposed to be Morrowind. Morrowind, the one everyone says they like, but no one makes games like that anymore. So if your tabletop game, isn't supposed to be like Morrowind, you would have to tell people how to do that. And so I'm, from the designer POV, I let the fronts mentality that you saw in games like at least Dungeon World entertain the idea that your world is multipolar and different things are going on.
Yeah, I want to say that one of the reasons why that is in video games and even in tabletop RPGs is a sort of anti-frustration rule, right? Because, at least for me personally, finding these global clocks, if they're always, I think there was an entire game made around the global clock. Every time you went to a place, like, you only have 10 minutes to do this. And so it's like, oh my God, I cannot make any mistakes. I'm going to lose, right? And then you have the death spiral and all that, which we should do a podcast on timing and who controls the weather, right? Who could actually control when things happen, right? But I think as a final word is that, and summarizing everything that happened, is that it's a good beginning for someone who is new to especially running a game like Dungeons & Dragons or any other game, The problem is that the tools they don't present any real tools, and they don't give a chance for the game to evolve into what
season of Critical Role are we on now?
Yeah. And so it's expected that everything that gets published will follow the same thing because that's what you're supposed to do. And when somebody says, but what about this? Like, as we said before, no, you can't because it's not in the adventure. And
right.
So,
and I will second that by saying, like, I don't necessarily have a problem with that. It's just that the game the RPG will be of two different minds, because every RPG says it's about imagination and expressing yourselves. They have big, long statements, and each one gets more and more permissive without express yourselves. And like I'm fond of saying, as long as it doesn't matter, as long as it doesn't have any impact on anything that's going on, you can do whatever the hell you want. And I think that sends a bad message, because I think it shakes the game down to where the only people who remain are people who are, it gets you that Deadpool mentality of everyone's obnoxious, murder tourists, because that's, nothing you do actually matters or has any impact. And once again, I'm not saying that your game might not have that. I'm saying our entire point here about the guided tours is everyone's agreeing that what we're seeing from Wizards of the Coast and some of the published adventures it's very simple, and they're not growing out of it. They're supposed to, instead of introducing new ideas to you over time, they're just mired in that. And I'm sorry. Any parting thoughts?
that was my final thoughts on that. Yeah.
And that's mine. So how about you, Red?
I think what's missing is more defined frameworks, like in rule books, for how to write adventures that are truly open-ended and reactive. Like, if your space is a dungeon, all you really need is a list of rooms and a list of things in those rooms. If your space is a city or a kingdom or an entire continent, then you need more than that, and you need a way to be able to react reflexively to your character's choices within that space. So abstraction is the key thing. And we pointed out Dungeon, the Powered by the Apocalypse games. I think an interesting thing with the 5th edition of Vampire is that they use a relationship map, which I thought is a really cool tool, and again sort of just helps you visualize that this game is, the physical walls of the game don't matter so much as the relationship and connections to the NPCs. That's really what defines what you're doing.
And that took what, 5 editions to show up? I mean, this is more than 5.
I guess.
But yeah,
so.
But I mean, that's the kind of game that should have that, because if you're right. That perfect. That's exactly what we're talking about. If the game is supposed to be about this, then have it be about this. Yeah. Vampire shouldn't be having amusement park rides.
Right. Yeah. So. Yep. So that's what I want.
We're all in agreement. So yeah, have fun with your ride, but try to move beyond it. So that's been Notes for the Aleph today. Thanks. We stream this every other Friday. Where you come watch us out. And we also stream other games, because Sunday is the Forbidden Lands and Wednesday is the Iron Claw, and Lessons. You're also Wednesday, right?
Sunday's Shadowrun.
Sunday is Shadowrun. But there are other stuff going on. So go ahead and watch all that. And of course, we've been to conventions and jazz like that. So thanks for coming by and watching us. We may be angry people, but we wish you the best in gaming. And Griffin should be back sometime in the future. Hopefully they've survived.
Take care.
See ya.